So I gotta tell a story. There was a Yid who was very famous in Lubavitch. We call him, the Rebbe called him, the Rogatchover, the genius of Rogatchov, or in Russian it's with a hey, Rogatchov. His name was Reb Yosef. His family name was Rosen. He was born in 1859 and he passed away in 1936. He was an extraordinary mind. The Rebbe quoted him more than any Achron all the time, and it almost seems like the Rebbe saw him as his teacher in Nigle. Incredibly creative. He was an extraordinary mind. The Rebbe said about the Rogatchover that he was a couple of hundred years out of place. The emergence of his mind into this world was a few hundred years late. It was an incredible mind. Incredible mind means he had a good memory, but a lot of people have good memories. Some people have good memories. But the depth of his understanding and his genius at corollary, his ability to find constants from the most diverse parts of Shas, made him literally one of a kind. He created a unique approach to the study of Talmud, of Gemara, which is very philosophical. It's not technical. It's based on theoretical laws. Yes, theoretical laws that the foundations of many of the great, expansive discussions that you have in the Shas. And Rogatchover wrote many books, and many books have been written from his writings that flush out his genius and his very original way of interpreting Shas. It's almost like philosophy, almost like Ruchni, it's almost like Chassidus kind of. An incredible mind, the Rogatchover Gaon. He was notorious for being with a sharp tongue. Throughout his life, he was the kind of person you wouldn't miss the opportunity to meet, but you hoped he didn't decide to tell you what he thought of you, because he was rather direct in his abilities to assess people. You know, the story goes that a very prominent rabbi came to see him, and he didn't know what to do. On the one hand, if he comes back to his town where he's Rav, and he says he was together with the Rogatchover and didn't have a conversation and learning, they're going to fire him from his Rabbanis. On the other hand, if he approaches the Rogatchover is going to mop the floor with him, make him feel like a fool. So he didn't know what to do, so he decided he'll risk it. He went over to the Rogatchover and he had a lengthy conversation, and it was so pleasant. He asked, and the Rogatchover answered, and back and forth. And so when it was all done, he said to the Rogatchover, you know, the Rogatchover is famous for his sharp tongue and for his being mevatel zayin lomdim, for the way he puts scholars in their place. You treated me very nicely. He says, of course, scholars I put in their place. Regular people I treat very nicely. Regular people I treat very nicely. This was him. But when he was young, he was fire, mamish. He came from the Hasidic stock. His father was a Tzemach Tzedek's Chassid, the name of the Rabbi Fischl, a very big Gaon himself. And when he was a boy, his father brought him to Lubavitch. And the Tzemach Tzedek had a son, the Maril, took the Tzemach Tzedek's holy hand and put it on the Rogatchover's head, and he gave him a bracha for limud hanigla, for learning Torah. And he was really one of a kind. And when you learn the Rebbe's siches, and you see how the Rebbe develops ideas of the Rogatchover, you see this, that he developed an original approach to interpreting Shas. There's no question about it. But this is the story that I want to share. He came from the Hasidic persuasion. He would put on tefillin like we do, you know, away from his body, not towards his body. He loved the Chassidim. And he followed the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch when it came to Hilchos Pesach. He was part of the Hasidic camp, but he wasn't a Chassid. He was a lamdan. He was a genius and he was a scholar, but the Rogatchover had Kislev out of Farbrengen, and after 15 minutes he was running away. He had no shpilkas. He had no patience. Rogatchover couldn't sit still for a second. He was a rabbi of the community. And he was the first one to finish Menesre. You know, the way it's supposed to work is everyone finishes davening, and then the rabbi lingers, and everyone waits, and the rabbi does Oiseh Shalom, and then you start Chazar Sashatz. He was the first one to finish. So he said, Rebbe, Vata bisele, before you wait a little, give us a chance. He said, "Das ist schon mitten warten. I waited already." That's what I waited. He was a very impatient man. He had no patience. He couldn't sit still. His brain was wow. So he made a sojourn. He made a journey through Eastern Europe as an 18-year-old. But understand, at the age of 18, he literally had mastered the entire Tesh Baal Peh. Mastered it. Bavli and Yerushalmi and the Midrashim and the Halachas Svarim, he knew it all. He didn't just know it all, he understood it with such depth that he had an original approach to interpreting it at the age of 18. He was an extraordinary mind. And his deal was that he was trying to find people who were his peers, who were his equals. He wanted to spar. He wanted to fight in Torah. But all the people around him were children next to him. Even rabbis with white beards. He was an 18-year-old boy. Rabbis 3-4 times his age, were older. I mean, they were great people, the wonderful Jews. They didn't have his mind, they didn't have his breadth, they didn't have his depth. And he was looking for sparring partners. So he went from shtetl to shtetl, and he went into the Rav, to the rabbi in the town, and you're talking now, middle 1870s. There were very, very prominent rabbis in Russia at that point. And usually within 15 minutes he was done. The guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a nice guy, but that's where it ends. But once in a while, he would actually meet his match. He wasn't the only genius. And when he would meet a rabbi who could spar with him, they would go at each other like two bull elephants for hours. Yeah, they would throw pages at each other. I mean, I've heard descriptions of the Rebbe talking to some of the geniuses of our generation, and you stood and watched two goinim. They didn't quote Gemaras, they quoted pages. You know, Taisvis, but Metziyat of Gimel with Beis. No, Rashi and Zvachim of Zayin Amidalf. And they knew what they're talking about. The people on the outside knew what it was. It was a computer talk. It was super speed. It was a whole different language. And when he met a rabbi that he could spar with, he didn't mind losing. He wanted the thrill of of locking horns and going at it, you know. And sometimes he won and sometimes he lost. But he was into this. This was his thing. He was 18 years old. Anyway, he came to Lublin. Lublin is a city in Poland that always had very, very prominent Rabbanim. It's just interesting. The Rabbanim of Lublin were very famous as great Goinim, even though Lublin was not necessarily the largest city in all of Poland. When the Rogatchov came to Lublin, the Lubliner Rav was a Lubavitcher Chassid by the name of Reb Zalman Fratkin, who was a Mechaber the Shas Tshuvas Teiras Chassid. He was then probably in his 60s. The Rogatchov was 18. He was a senior Chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek, and he also, you know, it says in the books that when he went to a Sfarim market, he didn't pay for a book because he took it. He paid for a book because he looked through it, because once he saw it, he had no need for it. His memory was that kind of a mind. So the younger Rogatchov walks into the old Teiras Chassid, and they fought like lions for hours. When the conversation was over, the Rogatchov staggered out of the house like a drunk, and he's muttering to himself as he's walking through the streets of Lublin, "Oder Alter can lernen. Oder Alter, this old man can learn." He met his match. Oder Alter can lernen. This old man can learn. But when you meet a man like that, so you have recommendations. So he says to the Lubliner rabbi, the Lubliner Rav, "Is there anybody else in Lublin that I should go to talk to in learning?" He says, "Yeah, Lublin had a Rebbe." Lubliner Rav was a Lubavitcher Chassid. The Lubliner Rebbe was a Talmud of the Kotzker, or the Ishbitzer, Talmud of the Kotzker's Talmidim. His name was Reb Tzadok HaKohen, a very famous Chassidic Rebbe, also an incredible genius, a master. His Sfarim, he wrote the most interesting Sfarim. He wrote Sfarim on topics that you never heard of, and you see his mastery. He knew the whole Torah, like on his fingers. But he was a Chassidic Rebbe. What's the difference between a Chassidic rabbi and a Chassidic Rebbe? A Chassidic rabbi is a scholar who tells you what to do and what not to do. A Rebbe is a whole other situation. So the Rogatchov, this 18-year-old genius, walks into the Lubliner Rebbe's home with a recommendation. He knows that this rabbi is a scholar of sufficient proficiency that he and him can actually spar. The Lubliner Rebbe is sitting with his hands folded, and the Rogatchov walks in. As soon as he steps across the threshold, he starts throwing pages at him. You know, this Gemara. He's trying to goad him. and each page means something, and Reb Tzadok HaKohen knows what it means, and he knows how he's goading him, and he's trying to get him to get so agitated, so nervous, he'll have to respond, and then they'll fight. He wanted to engage in Machamta Shel Torah. He wanted to engage in the debate of Torah, and the Lubliner Rebbe is sitting with his hands folded, looking at him like he's a monkey. And Rogatchov is going and going and going and going. And finally, he came up for breath. He realizes that he has no sparring partner. The Lubliner spielt nicht. The Lubliner Rebbe wasn't playing. The Lubliner Rav played. The Lubliner Rebbe wasn't playing. So he stops. So when he stops throwing pages at the Lubliner Rebbe tells him what I think is the sweetest insight into Chassidus. He says to him, Yungerman, in Yiddish, he says to him, Yungerman, ich bin amol euch gäuwän azay wie du. Gäfäarעn über der Welt und gäwizn, als keiner kann nicht lernen. Aber es ist nicht kein Leben. Geh gäfin sich erheben, soll der Oislärnän, wie m'dארף dienen dem Eibärschten. That's the quote. Young man, I was once just like you. I went from place to place and I showed everybody that I'm smarter than them. I was only 18 and they were 50 and they were dumb and I was smart. And it was true. It was true. But that's not life. That's not life. That's nonsense. That's not life. It's not life. Go find yourself a Rebbe. Let him teach you how to serve God. Go find yourself a Rebbe. A Rebbe, a Hasidic Rebbe, not a Rosh Yeshiva who teaches Talmud. A Rebbe. And let him teach you how you're supposed to serve God. I absolutely love this story. I love this story. I tell it at every opportunity. Because I think here is a real demonstration of what Chassidus was about. The Baal Shem Tov fathered Chassidus. Baal Shem Tov founded Chassidus. And he fathered Chassidus for everybody. On the one hand, Chassidus inspired some of the greatest minds of the last several centuries. And on the other hand, Chassidus touched the hearts of millions and millions and millions, and still touches the hearts of millions and millions of very simple, plain people who barely know how to read. And somehow, it moves them. This story is the constant. You're a bright guy, you're a smart guy. Chassidus doesn't say that smart is not important. Chassidus says, m'dארף dienen dem Eibärschten. You have to take all of the skill and the gifts that God gave you and develop a relationship with God. And this is an entirely different endeavor. It's an entirely different thing. We are here together as a group at a Farbrengen because it's Rosh Hashanah l'dach, the head of the year, the new year of Chassidus, as the Rebbe Rashab declared it. This is the beginning of the Chassidic calendar, as you test Kislev. And, Chassidus is, I'll tell you, Chassidus is very precise. It was born in 1734, that's its birthday. And now we're holding 2022. So Chassidus is about 188 years old, something like that, right? Chassidus is 280, it's close to 300 years old. It's close to 300 years old. And still you'll ask a person, what's Chassidus? Well, the guys with the funny hats, and the long sideburns. What is it? So exactly what is Chassidus? I want you to know that years ago when I travel a little bit for public speaking, although as I mentioned before, and I should go let 10 minutes go by without reminding you that I have a website called internetchassidus.org, and I'm really more teacher than public speaker, and I'd love to teach you. But when I was once, years and years ago, I took out a dictionary and I looked up the word Hasidism. I looked it up. It was very good. It's a good definition. Oxford got it right. He said it's a mystical sect of Eastern European Jews, Ashkenazic Jews, that believe in an immanent God. Immanent God means present, not hovering, not surrounding, but deeply involved, who emphasize the worship of God with joy. That's the quote. It's a mystical sect of whatever, a few ultra Orthodox Jews from Eastern Europe that believe in an immanent God, a God that's very present, Hashgacha Pratis, that emphasize the service of God with joy. It's quite accurate. It's quite accurate. What is it about Chassidus? What was it and what is it about Chassidus? It was this. Chassidus came into this world to help people figure out how to have a relationship with God. If you understand the early history of Chassidus, The early history of Chassidus was burdened by terrible, terrible politics, by a chasm in the Jewish world, which is mamish historic. I'm not going to say it's the only time it happened, but it's one of the most severe divisions in the Jewish people. Was the division that was manifest as a result of the Baal Shem Tov coming into the world. It was very difficult. And if you lived then, if you were a disciple of the Alter Rebbe's, chances are your parents were not Chassidim. Your wife's parents were not Chassidim. So your decision to become a Chassid was a very, very costly undertaking. Because if they would find out, in some cases they would disown you. Marriage you were torn to pieces. One of the most tragic facts of what happened was that when Chassidim came out of the closet as Chassidim, they'd be boycotted, and their business would go bankrupt. To be a Chassid then was extraordinarily costly. So why did they do it? They were great scholars. They didn't need... The Lumdis and Lite was unbelievable. The amount of scholarship that existed then in that part of the world was also historic. What did they want from the Alter Rebbe? What did they want from Alter Rebbe's contemporaries? They wanted a relationship with God. That's what they wanted. And they knew all the Torah in the world better than they knew much Kabbalah. But they needed direction. They needed a Rebbe, needed a teacher who could bring them closer to Hashem. For big people, it's on a very, very gigantic level. And for little people, it's on a very, very small level. But for all people, that's what Chassidus is. Chassidus is a movement that speaks to a Jew finding in himself his relationship with Hashem, and like I said before, with joy on his level. Each person his level, and each one in his way. Chassidus is very diversified. There's different groups, there's different sects, different forms, different size hats, and different color shoes and socks and all the rest. But they all share this, that Chassidim came to a Rebbe because they wanted the Rebbe to teach them how to come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So l'chaim, we should have a little shaychus to Chassidus. We should be Chassidim in a minuscule, in a microcosm, in a small little way. When the previous Rebbe was a little boy, his father was sick a lot. And oftentimes, for months at a time, he was away from his parents. His father traveled for health, and he never traveled alone. It's very interesting. He always traveled with his wife, with the Rebbitzin, with his wife. And the previous Rebbe was an only child. He was little. 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, 7, and he'd be left with his Baba, with his grandmother. She was a very sweet, nice lady, but his parents would disappear for months at a time. He had a very, very hard child. B'chlal, the Fidik Rebbe's life was Yen 11. The more you study this man's life, you don't understand how this person did what he did and was such a positive man. His life was just tzadus. But once in a while, when his father traveled, he'd go along. And when he traveled with his father, it was delightful, because his father would learn with him. And of course, wherever they came, all the Chassidim came to give honor to his father. His father was all of 25 at the time, you understand? But he was the Rebbe. And the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, got to be around great Chassidim who were many times his father's age, let alone his age, who were showing great respect for his father. So there's an occasion which the previous Rebbe tells the story where there was a Farbrengen, a Chassidic gathering with the Rebbe Rashab, with the previous Rebbe's father. And after the Farbrengen, the previous Rebbe was all of 7 years old, said to the Chassidim, so what did my father tell you? What did my father tell you? So they said, your father told us, what is a Chassid? So the 7-year-old previous Rebbe says, he told that to me 6 months ago. I knew before you, he told that to me 6 months ago. So one of the Chassidim says, your father told you, was is a chassidul? Your father told you what's a little chassid. He told us what's a chassid. So whether we're chassiduls or chassidim, l'chaim